Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ninth webinar of the 22-23 IMOS webinars program. My name is Francesco Schirripa, and I am a researcher in statistics at the University of Pisa in Italy. As member of the IMOS team of my university, I'm working at the organization of this webinar program on behalf of Eurostat, together with the German company Stadapt. Today, I'll act as the webinar moderator. Now, let me first explain for any newcomers that EMO stands for the European Master in Official Statistics, a joint project of university and data producer in the EU member states, EFTA and EU candidate countries. If your university is interested in applying for the EMOS label, please consider that a permanently open call for universities available on the EMOS dedicated page on the Eurostat website. For staying in contact with the EMOS news and communities, please follow the EMOS Twitter. The Twitter handle is @AU_EMOS. It's now time to start with our webinar. Before I give the floor to our speaker, let me first explain how we run the webinar today. As you can see, this year the EMOS webinar stream on Zoom. The webinar is recorded, and the recording will be uploaded on the EMOS YouTube channel, where you can already find the recording of the past webinar as well as the past two EMOS workshops. As a participant, you can watch and listen to the webinar. You can also use the Q&A manager to pose your questions to the presenting during the webinar. Our speaker will be answering questions during one break and at the end of our presentation. Should you have any technical problem or questions, please send a message in the chat. You will be contacted by one of the members of the technical staff. Today, we have the pleasure to host Faidra Filippidou. Faidra is energy efficiency research at E3 Modeling. Prior to joining this company, she worked at the Delft University of Technology and the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Her research focuses on the energy saving and the decarbonization potential of building stocks, renewable heating and cooling, and the interface of energy demand and supply. Today, Faidra will present about the phenomenon of energy poverty across EU member states. Faidra, the floor now is yours until the first question break.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you, everyone that's participating today in this webinar. I'm gonna try and share my slides first, and hopefully you will be able to see it in presentation mode by now. Perfect. So I'm Faidra Filippidou. As Francesco said, I'm working at a small company, research-based, in Greece, in Athens. That's called E3 Modeling. And today I'm gonna present to you a few things that we already know about and some new research on the phenomenon of energy poverty in Europe. And part of it is how do we measure and map it. Before I start, I'd like to, because I know that for the majority of you, your background is economics. So I thought I should share a little bit about me so that you know my background and how we can connect. So I studied mechanical engineering at first in Greece. Then I moved to the Netherlands in Delft, and I did a master's on sustainable energy technologies. And when I finished that, I did my PhD in the Department of Architecture, again in the Technical University of Delft in the Netherlands. And that was on the energy performance progress of the Dutch non-profit housing stock. And I analyzed that by modeling it through a longitudinal assessment model, let's say. After that, still in the Netherlands, I started working at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. And my main focus there, as I did my research, was energy efficiency in buildings, power and heat sector coupling, that's a bit more technical, and energy poverty. After that, in the middle of COVID in 2021, I decided to move back to Greece. And now I'm working as an energy efficiency researcher at E3 Modeling. And the basic work that we do, except for research projects like Horizon funded and from the EU, is that we run all the models that the Commission is using to form the climate and energy targets for the European Union. Now, I start a little bit with an introduction about buildings and why this is important and how it connects to energy poverty, basically. Now, buildings and in general, in this context of decarbonization and the energy transition that we all hear about the last years, heating and cooling, which is a very big sector in our lives, let's say, and in the energy system as a whole, actually represents half of the energy consumption in the European Union. Now that means from all that we do, heating and cooling is 50% of what we consume in terms of energy. That is also supplied 75% by fossil fuels, which is something that we are trying to combat through the decarbonization, right? Part of the heating and cooling sector are buildings. And in buildings, we mean all residential buildings, houses, but also all buildings that are like in the services sectors, like buildings like supermarkets or hospitals or hotels and so on. And they account for 40% of the total final energy consumption in the EU. Now, why are buildings important? Because in buildings, basically we consume energy and we have to pay for it. And what is energy poverty and how it connects? In, let's say, in the global north context where EU is, energy poverty has its roots in the British term because they were the first to basically analyze and examine the phenomenon in the term fuel poverty. Now, energy poverty is a situation, basically, as the Commission describes it, in which households are unable to access essential energy services and products. In other words, in 2010, the World Economic Forum defined energy poverty as the inability to access sustainable modern energy services and products. But all these are partial, let's say, definitions of energy poverty. How we commonly understand it and describe it is that energy poverty is a situation where individuals, people, are not able to actually adequately heat their homes at a cost that is affordable, that they can pay for it. And this is a problem that gets a lot of attention and focus nowadays across EU member states. Now, why do we talk about energy poverty? Part of it is because it's a very complex phenomenon that combines basically three major pillars, right? First, it's society, because we're talking about households and people and how this is affected through social policies. Then the other pillar is energy, how we consume energy and what are the policies around energy. And third is economy and all the economic policies and basically how do we pay for the service of energy. Now, not studying it in this context basically impedes the understanding of it. We are not able to fully grasp or understand or even tackle the phenomenon, in other words. Energy poverty occurs when actually energy bills are at a very high percentage of the consumer's income, or when the consumer must reduce the energy consumption, so not put the heating on or not put the air conditioning on to a degree that basically has negative impacts to the health and their well-being. Now, due to the fact that it's a very, let's say, private issue and we are not able to, through statistics or numbers, fully understand it, and it affects mainly households, energy poverty remains a major challenge and it still exists to in our continent and in the EU to a variable degree across member states. But according to Eurostat, about 35 million European citizens, and that is approximately 8% of the population, were unable to keep their homes adequately warm. If we move to a map from Eurostat, you will see that there are many countries that actually have very low percentages of energy poverty. But there are others, the ones in blue mainly, that those numbers exceed 10%, right, of the population. As we said, the situation is varying across the EU, but there is, with the largest share of people that they are unable to keep, this is one indicator for energy poverty, right? We will talk about that in a while, but they're unable to keep their home adequately warm are in Bulgaria, following by Lithuania, Cyprus, Portugal, and Greece, which we will talk about it later today. On top of that, what happened in 2021, and we all felt it in 2022, as it worsened the situation with Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and the fact that EU countries and the world in general, but specifically the EU, had not fully recovered from the COVID-19 crisis, and by that I mean the economy. The situation about the energy poverty is likely to have worsened across EU member states and for EU citizens. But where does the EU stand with policies that address energy poverty? Because what we said before is that it affects basically society, energy, and economy, and all that has an impact on policies. To have an understanding of what is the current status of energy policy in the EU is of vital importance here. So basically, okay, this is a diagram that has many details. Maybe you can study them later if you're interested in that. But basically from 2016 to 18, there was a very big effort made to create the Clean Energy for All Europeans package that set the basic targets, let's say, for the EU until 2030 when it comes to energy and greenhouse gas emissions. And that was minus 40% compared to 1990 levels for greenhouse gas emissions, renewable energy share of 32%, and energy efficiency reduction basically of energy by 32.5%. In 18 and 19, they pushed the boundaries further. There was a zero net CO2 emissions by 2050. And all that was depicted in the National Energy and Climate Plans at the end of 2019 that all countries had to basically send to the Commission. The plans in terms of what are the policies that are going to be followed so that collectively the whole EU reaches the targets. Now, there are certain current trends, but what is the most important in the last, let's say, year or month is that this target from 40% that it was in the end of 2018 has been pushed to minus 55% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And basically, after the energy crisis of the last 2 years, there is a new plan, the Repower EU plan, that its aim is to create funds and to, despite of the energy crisis, for EU countries to continue with the energy transition. Now, where does energy poverty stand in this whole EU policy agenda? Still, it's a major challenge, and there have been some very important phrases, but also actions that put energy poverty the last years very high in the policy agenda. That was first introduced when the Commission talked about protecting vulnerable consumers and creating a just energy transition to climate neutrality. On top of that, in the next round of NECPs, these are the National Energy and Climate Plans that countries have to send to the Commission. They have to include measures specifically to tackle energy poverty. And on top of that, all these packages that we are talking about with the goals, they have certain laws or directives, as we call them, below, that all member states have to actually implement in their legislation. And energy poverty is present explicitly in the Energy Efficiency Directive, which is one of the most important directives in terms of the energy goals of the EU at the moment. On top of that, the Fit for 55 package that was adopted in July 2021 proposed that there should be specific measures and to identify the key drivers of energy poverty risks for consumers, such as too high energy prices, low household income, and poor energy efficient buildings. And these are, if you connect them to what we said before about the 3 pillars, basically what we need to understand the drivers and to measure in order to basically alleviate the phenomenon of energy poverty. And how can we actually measure it? And how are we doing it so far? Basically, there are several energy poverty indicators. There is not one, are you energy poor or not? And we cannot measure it like that. And again, we are talking about low income, energy bills, and energy efficiency. Energy efficiency basically relates to the building itself. It does not relate to the consumer, but in the end, it relates to the household, right? And what we need to know from here is what is the tenure system. By tenure here, we mean, are you renting your house or do you own it? Are you in a non-profit housing? Then the housing characteristics, and by that we mean, how old is the house? Maybe it was built in 1960, or it's built in 2010 and the building code has evolved so far so that you have high energy efficiency at your home. Then we have income. And this is basically one of, because there's a lot of research discussing whether everyone that is poor are they actually energy poor as well? And the opposite. And then the energy bills, basically. So, and these relate to income, to energy prices, but also to the energy consumption level of its household. And last, it's the energy use patterns. So what type of energy consumption? Basically, are you working or are you on pension? Is it a single person living in a house or a family? These also play a role. And then the type of heating system, and if it's a central heating system or a non-central one, a non-centralized one. Now, generally in research and also in statistics, there are 3 prevailing measurement methods, right, to identify energy poverty. The first group of indicators are expenditure-based, that basically estimate the magnitude of energy poverty in a household by considering the household's costs for energy and their income, comparing them to a certain threshold. The second one, they're consensual-based indicators. And these are when you have, for example, a survey and the inhabitants assess themselves their household's living conditions. And these basically have to do with thermal comfort and other conditions like humidity, do you have insulation or not, and their ability, the ability of the consumers, the citizens, to afford the expenditures required in order to secure a healthy living condition. The way we measure it in terms of, as engineers, what is a healthy living condition in a building is basically to at least be able to keep your house warm at 18 degrees. And last is direct measurement, which basically sets a standard for an offered energy service, either it's heating or cooling, and then assesses energy poverty against the standard. Now, the first set of indicators, as we said, the expenditure base, that are actually also the most common ones and the ones that the Energy Poverty Observatory is working with, of the Commission and a lot of researchers, and not only, that estimate the magnitude of energy poverty considering the costs versus the income. Actually, this method used to measure energy poverty as the 10% rule that was proposed by Bortman in 1991. And this 10% rule identifies as energy poor those households that spend on energy expenses more than 10% of their income, of their net income. However, this rule has been contested if it's successful and if it actually measures energy poverty correctly or not, because all the other factors that we talked about, energy efficiency, the cost of energy, are not actually considered. And there are several other approaches. I don't want to tire you with all of this. However, you see that the literature is there if you want to search more about this. But there are several other ways that researchers and people have tried to measure energy poverty. One of the most basically used ones lately are these multidimensional energy poverty indices, or what the EU Energy Poverty Advisory Hub has proposed are to use basically several different indicators. And what they are doing is that they're using 4 primary and 19 secondary in order to capture the phenomenon. So the primary indicators about the that the Energy Poverty Advisory Hub is using basically comprise of the shares of the population that either are delaying paying their bills, their energy bills, and that they cannot keep their homes sufficiently warm. And these are based on the EU SILK survey, which you can, I think, freely access through Eurostat. As well as the household income and energy expenditure. And this is from the HBS, the Household Budget Survey of Eurostat. And for example, this means energy expenses being more than twice of the national average. And this would let's say, mark you as energy poor. Now, the secondary indicators include several things that are studied, and they include average prices paid by a household, not only for electricity and gas, and that the majority of people are using to heat and cool their homes, but also from district heating and other specific fuels, such as fuel oil, biomass, coal, etc. Energy consumption expenditure on electricity and gas as a share of income. And these are split into 5 income categories. Accommodation-related indicators, such as, for example, the average number of rooms per person. Is the house rented or not? The location, because very often more densely populated and urban areas show higher percentages of energy poverty. The dwelling, the household condition, is there any leakage, dampness, are the walls humid or not? And last, people that are at risk of poverty, not energy poverty, but poverty or social exclusion. Except for the Energy Poverty Observatory and the hub that we just talked about in terms of official statistics, measuring energy poverty has also been a great deal of the work that the Covenant of Mayors is doing. You can also search more about that. That is a network basically of cities that are that are working more locally to tackle the phenomenon of energy poverty. And these are based, the work that they are doing is based on 6 classes of indicators. And then there are, of course, sub-indicators, and these include climate, facilities, and what is the condition of households, mobility, because we also do have the concept of transport energy poverty. This is when basically you cannot afford to pay tickets on public transport or reach your destination the way you would like it. Socioeconomic aspects, policy and regulatory framework, and last, participation and awareness raising that they're trying to do. To conclude, after all these detailed and, let's say, more explanatory things about energy poverty and how it is measured, we have to repeat, in order to understand it, that it is a complex phenomenon and that is touching upon several societal issues, and measuring it is a challenge. Now, I would like to ask you if you have any questions so far, and I would be more than happy to answer.
Yeah, we have 2 questions. 3 questions.
Perfect.
Okay, I read it. The share of population that is not able to keep the home warm is high in southern countries. Is cooling also included, or does this mainly reflect income differences? That is, even though heating demand is lower, households are still less able to afford it?
Yeah, actually, this is a very good question. It is exactly on point with where research is going regarding energy poverty. In the slide that I showed, basically, because in Europe, the majority of countries, and in general, also if you see statistics regarding energy consumption, we basically consume way more on heating than on cooling. Of course, the European South requires a lot, and actually, as the climate is changing, even Northern European countries will be needing more cooling. In the slide that I showed, and generally what is used by official statistics, cooling is not there, but it is measured. It is a matter of great importance, because when we talked about healthy living conditions as well, you heat your home to 18 degrees, but you have to be able also to cool it to 26 degrees. Officially, with the ways that, I mean, we're not able, unfortunately, to have sensors everywhere to understand exactly the situation. But yeah, cooling is included. And in the second leg of the question, there is also the phenomenon that I didn't talk about in this presentation because I thought it's too detailed for that, but you're already there. Is the concept of hidden energy poverty. That is actually when you cannot measure it, because there is a large share of population that basically would prefer to heat their home partially or to lower the thermostat in order to be able to pay the bills. And that is very difficult to be captured by statistics. There are several small research projects that are trying to work on these aspects, and hopefully we will have more data and ways to work through it on that. Okay. I hope the answer was clear.
We have another question. Yeah, the second one is strictly related to this one. The third, in order to be used to compare energy poverty across EU states, are the indexes controlling in some way for the different climate condition? For example, North with South Europe, or the different age of the buildings?
In general, in the ones that are in the indicators that are used in terms of the official ones from the Energy Poverty Observatory, they're not always connected to buildings, but more on households, and they're survey-based. However, on research and when we model things, we always, across EU member states, work with heating and cooling degree days, and that's how you correct for climate differences. If that explains, if that answers your question. And the different age of buildings plays a huge role. There are models working with one representative building for each country and others that basically have the whole typology of buildings. So let's say, what is the percentage of buildings in Greece that were built, or in Italy or in Germany, anywhere, that were built before 1945, that we know there were no thermal insulation rules on building codes, and so on. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. The last one, how was the threshold of 10% originally estimated? Is there any stated threshold of how should the energy weight on the overall household consumption?
The first one, I think it had to do with the deciles, and actually I shouldn't be lying, and it would be better if you would read the original research on that. And if there are any stated thresholds, there are many in literature, but basically, usually, the more you're able to split the income deciles, the percentages of how you can split in a country and what are the expenditures of each, on that would be the most preferable one, but that's always dependent on data that you have. So many times there are basically, not enough data to do that. And that's why usually, I mean, Eurostat uses the 5 income classes. There are models that are trying to have at least deciles, so 10. And so on. It's the same with basically different types and ages of buildings. The more you can include, the better representation you will have. Yeah, but there is not one good answer for that.
Okay, thank you. No question anymore, so we can go on with the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, good. I hope some things are better explained also through the questions so far. And if you have more or are too shy to ask at this moment, please keep your question for the end as well. Now, moving on, I will show you a few things that we have done in the research group that I am now, using a model actually to predict also what will happen with energy poverty, and we did that for Greece. To get you a bit again into understanding how policy impacts energy poverty and vice versa, the Greek energy policy framework basically has laws and regulations like in every other EU member state that are largely, to a large extent, harmonized with most of the European Commission directives. Now, in the European Commission directives, there are things that are obligatory and there are things that are advised, let's say, for each member state. And that's why for many of those directives and updates of the directives, the Commission proposes a change, and then it has to go through the legislative process and through the European Parliament in order to be really changed and, become obligatory or not for member states. Now, so Greece is largely harmonized, and especially in the last couple of years with the REPowerEU plan and the energy crisis, there are policy measures that are aiming to protect vulnerable consumers and especially low-income households. Now, energy poverty as a share of population, with the blue lines here in this graph, you see, so this is like a dual index. With the blue bar, you're seeing the unable people, share of population that is unable to keep their home adequately warm. And with the red one, you see the ones that are unable to pay the utility bills the energy bills on time. Now you see that, for example, Bulgaria has a very large share, Lithuania as well. What is remarkable with Greece, basically, is that in terms of unable to keep the house warm, we are around 22%. But when it comes to being unable to keep, to pay the utility bills, we are more than 35% of the population is not able to pay their utility, their energy bills on time. Whereas the EU average is less than 10%, is around 8%. And that creates, a huge gap. Now, in general, and as we discussed before, among the several methodological approaches to identify the energy poor households, the Greek Ministry of Environment and Energy has selected 4 indicators of the European the Energy Poverty Advisory Hub, the 4 main ones that we saw at the beginning. However, the Center of Renewable Energy Sources and Energy Saving, that is in charge of the National Observatory of Energy Poverty, has proposed an additional indicator, and namely this is the coverage of energy needs per household. So are households able to cover their basic energy needs? And that is relating to what we discussed before, being able to keep your house warm or cool in the summer. And this should be calculated as the ratio of actual recorded energy consumption to the theoretically required energy consumption for these uses, to heat and to cool. And then you understand if there are households that are actually not heating enough or not cooling enough, comparing them to the theoretically required consumption that is needed. Now, when it comes to policy, actions are promoted towards 3 axes in Greece. The first is the consumer protection. So there are certain financial supports to households affected by extreme conditions of energy poverty. Then there are energy efficiency and renewables diffusion. There is a large scale, let's say, medium, small scale financing measures that have long-term impact. These have to do mostly with energy renovations. And when we talk about energy renovations, we refer mostly to the envelope of a building. So insulation, not only replacing the heating system from an oil boiler to a heat pump, for example. And last are informative and training actions for either affected consumers, but also for professionals, so that you know what are the measures that will have the best outcome for energy poor households. Now, one of the subjects that we really wanted to study in this research that I'm about to present to you are the implications of the European Green Deal, so this package of measures and the energy transition, on energy poverty and equity, justice, that is. So basically, we wanted to analyze what are the impacts for energy poor households if the EU, or Greece specifically in this paper, implements all these targets, all these measures in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% in 2030 and achieves the goal of climate neutrality by 2050. So the study focuses on Greece, and it combines a qualitative analysis of the EU and Greek policy context. And also, it relates to energy poverty alleviation measures, and it's based on state-of-the-art model-based assessment of the equity and the distributional incomes. What do we mean by that? So when there is an energy transition happening and there are certain measures and goals to be achieved, the impacts of such a transition are not balanced, they're not equal among the population or among households. And we wanted to see what is the income on the energy poor, right? And in simpler words, because I know that the previous may have been a bit complicated, basically we wanted to answer how can we model what energy poverty will look like in Greece in the future? What are the impacts of the energy transition on energy poor households? And which are those policy measures that basically can be implemented in order to ensure a just energy transition for all citizens? So the idea that, let's say, the hypothesis and a basic assumption behind this work is that the decarbonization of the energy system is not expected to impact uniformly all sectors of the economy. There are large reductions expected in carbon-intensive activities, industries, for example, mining, extraction, refineries. And these changes in the structure of the energy and economic systems will be accompanied by changes in fuel and electricity prices, but also they will be accompanied in changes in financing requirements, right? So the purchase and the operation of energy and electrical equipment appliances will change with increasing capital expenditures. For example, a heat pump costs way more than a gas or an oil boiler, and we are expecting lower operating and fuel purchasing expenditures, OPEX, because we will have more efficient systems, better insulated homes, and so on. The analysis is based on the GEM E3 FIT model that we did in this research, that is basically a computable general equilibrium model that assesses the implications of energy and climate policies. And as I said before, typically general equilibrium models, because they're not energy models, they're not sectoral energy models, they usually feature one single representative household in each national economy, right? And this basically is the weighted average of incomes and consumption patterns. And this basically is useful when you want to assess economy-wide phenomena. However, this aggregation may mask critical insights regarding social and distributional implications of climate policies among very diverse households in all member states, basically in the EU, and not only. Now, when we talk about distributional impacts, these refer to how costs and benefits of a policy or a set of policies basically are distributed among different regions, sectors, and households. And when we ignore those, basically there is no feedback loop to the policy itself, and we can continue creating policies that do not take this into account, and we continue having unequal societies because due to the lack of measures in order to mitigate negative impacts on vulnerable population groups. That was one of the reasons that in the GEMI 3, basically it was further expanded by colleagues to represent 10 household income classes in EU member states, so that it can consistently capture the potential distributional impacts. And that is the case that we are going to see here today also. Now, this is a bit of an introduction to how income inequality basically relates also to energy poverty and the inequalities there. Traditionally, there are several indicators and for measuring income inequality. And those have to do with the mean and median income by household, the decile dispersion ratio. And you can read all those here on the table, but also in the research. For example, the decile dispersion ratio is a measure that presents the ratio of the average income for example, the richest 10% of the population divided by the average income of the poorest 10%. And the indicator, however, is vulnerable to extreme values and outliers, right? So if you have, then we have the Gini coefficient that is based, I mean, I will not bore you with all of these, the Atkinson index and so on. However, this study focuses on expenditure-based indicators, and that was also the first set of indicators that I introduced at the beginning in order to assess energy poverty dynamics. And this was modeled on energy expenditure and income per decile, and in particular, the share of energy expenditure in income. And this indicator measures basically the percentage of households whose share of energy expenditure relative to their disposable income is more than twice the national median share, right? Basically, the situation in Greece, let's say now, is that the average is around 17%. And if you see the first decile, the poorest people, this rises to 55, whereas the richest 10%, basically they are close to 2, right? As a share of energy expenditure in income. So basically what you pay, what percentage is your energy bill of your disposable income. And because I'm running out of time, you will read a bit more of what GEMI 3 is modeling and how this is working. Basically, here we're explaining that it's a multi-regional and multi-sectoral model that provides details on the macroeconomy and the complex interactions with the environment and the energy system. But what we did in this study is that we created 2 scenarios. One is the reference scenario that basically meets the EU NDC nationally determined contribution to the UN in 2030, but there are no additional efforts after that. And then a decarbonization scenario where basically the EU achieves this minus 55% of emissions reduction in 2030 and 97% in 2050. So some assumptions and what is carbon pricing? And why is it important? Carbon pricing. The EU has a system that's called emissions trading scheme, and it's one of the most basic policies to combat climate change. And what does it do? Basically, in the power sector and most of the energy intensive industries have to pay a carbon tax. And those funds are actually collectively returned and recycled through the public budget. Now, in the decarbonization scenario, the policy mix adopted in the EU energy system decarbonization includes various instruments. So there is a strengthened emissions trading scheme. There are subsidies for buildings. So basically, we create a decarbonization environment that everything from policies that we are discussing nowadays and even more ambitious are actually implemented in the future. Now, that we more or less also saw before that the energy expenditure, the indicator 1, you see that the poorest actually have a higher share to their disposable income compared to the richest 10%. But what is interesting actually from the result is how this basically is affected in a decarbonization setting. With the blue bar charts, you see what is happening in the context of the reference scenario in energy expenditures. In the light blue, you see, and this is energy expenditure to the disposable income, the dark blue. What you see, what happens in 2050, the light blue is on top what you would pay for energy efficiency on top of your energy bill. And then the green one is when this is happening actually in a decarbonization scenario. So what you see here is that actually the poorest are affected way more in an energy transition scenario than the middle income or the highest income classes, right? So I need to conclude and leave some room for questions in the end. Decarbonization is efforts can result in large-scale economic restructuring, and there is a potential of regressive distributional impacts, right? Disproportionately affecting disadvantaged population groups. The imposition of additional carbon taxes on energy products and the need to purchase energy efficiency equipment may negatively affect low-income households. And environmental policies are commonly associated in literature with impacts especially to the low income, and ignoring such distributional effects can result in less effective policies and increased basically social inequalities. So in the end, well-designed strategies and policies are required in order to achieve progressive outcomes by considering appropriate compensation schemes. That was one of the most important, basically, conclusions of the research, either by increasing the household income through lump sum payments, or reducing other taxes, or through a social security system. Overall, basically, the model-based analysis shows that decarbonization increases modestly existing inequalities. However, using what we said before, the carbon revenues as lump sum transfers to households directly and not just dispersing it through the economy, and requiring reduced social security contributions has clear benefits. And these include increasing total employment. So they have economy-wide, basically, benefits, while significantly reducing inequality across income classes. Thank you very much for listening and for staying here for almost an hour with me. If there are any questions, I'll be pleased to answer. And you can always find me at my email. If you have any, let's say, questions that you didn't ask here today, or you would like to contact me for any of the topics that we discussed, I'll be more than happy to answer to you.
Okay, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. For now, I cannot see any questions, but I have some, but just some curiosity, because I do not know the model that you have used. I'm not an expert in this topic, but there is some assumption that this model has, and which are in general this.
You mean in general assumptions regarding the model itself, or basically the scenarios that are
no, the model itself.
The model itself, basically, what it does is that it represents, let's say, the EU countries individually. There are certain economic activities that are linked and represented through trade flows. It covers interlinkages between, basically, industry, the power sector, consumption, labor, capital, and basically it formulates supply and demand as economic agents, right? And then there is another model that basically is where I am working on mostly, that is on the energy system. But the two models, and specifically I work on buildings and basically the demand, the consumption sectors, and the two models are interlinked. So basically you can see the effects of the economy on the energy and vice versa. But these models have been, let's say, they started being developed in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, they, as inputs, for example, you have GDP, trade flows among countries, basically the whole set of supply and demand, let's say. If that, yeah, it's a very interesting field. I wasn't doing that before. I was more focused on buildings specifically, and more on insulation and other things, but the effects of that on the economy and the society are super interesting.
Okay, thank you. We have a question. How do you suggest to start analyzing poverty energy? There is an easier approach for beginners, according to you?
I think that actually there is a lack of understanding on those three pillars that we talked at the beginning about. So indeed, not being able to pay your bills, your energy bills, or living in a house that is very old and inefficient plays a role. However, in research so far, there is a slight lack of what are the impacts of social policies to energy poverty. So whether you're having a welfare system or not in a country plays a huge role. I think for a beginner, I would say that scrolling through statistics and what has happened so far, so to understand, let's say, in the Energy Poverty Advisory Hub of the Commission, what are the four main indicators and what are the rest of the more specific ones, and trying to find links there is super nice. And if you ever in your life, because I know that you're doing a master's on statistics and official ones, design a survey or anything like that, please be way more precise, because the better data that we have, the better we can understand phenomena. And I mean, the last decade, let's say, is going much better, but still we have a very big, hole there. And that's why we build models, basically, because we don't have good data.
Yeah, clear.
Yeah, in a way.
Okay. Okay, there are no other questions. So thank you, Faidra, for this very interesting
Thank you.